I never thought I'd find myself sitting in my father's study, surrounded by the remnants of his life, wondering where it all went wrong. The mahogany desk where he used to help me with my homework still held his reading glasses, placed neatly beside the Boston Globe he'd been reading the morning before his heart attack. The leather chair still bore the impression of his presence, and the air still carried the faint scent of his favorite pipe tobacco, a blend from the little shop on Beacon Street he'd visited every month for the past 30 years. Growing up in our brownstone in Back Bay, I'd always felt secure in my place within the family. Dad, James Sullivan to the rest of Boston's legal community, had always treated Sarah and me equally, or so I thought. He'd attended both our graduations from Boston Latin School with the same proud smile, helped us both move into our dorms at different colleges, and called us both every Sunday evening without fail. The routine was as predictable as the changing seasons along the Charles River. The morning of the will reading dawned cold and gray, typical for early March in Boston. I remember adjusting my black wool coat as I climbed the granite steps of the courthouse, my heels clicking against stone that had witnessed countless family dramas before mine. Sarah arrived just moments after me, her designer boots and perfectly styled hair making me feel somehow inadequate in my department store outfit. She'd always had that effect on me, even when we were kids sharing a room and fighting over closet space. "Ready for this, little sister?" she asked, her voice carrying that hint of superiority that had grown more pronounced since she'd become a partner at her law firm. I forced a smile and nodded, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. Something about her confidence made me uneasy, but I pushed the feeling aside. This was about Dad, about family, about closure, not about our old rivalries. The conference room felt too warm and too small as we gathered around the long table. Mr. Peterson, Dad's longtime friend and legal partner, adjusted his tie nervously as he began to read. I should have known something was wrong when I saw Sarah's slight smile, the way she kept checking her phone as if she already knew what was coming. The words washed over me like ice water. "To my daughter Sarah Sullivan, I leave my entire estate, including the family home, all investments, and my share in the firm." The ringing in my ears drowned out the rest. Through the blur of sudden tears, I saw Sarah's smile widen, watched her accept congratulations from the partners present. Someone touched my shoulder, probably Mr. Peterson, but I couldn't respond. 32 years of memories were suddenly being rewritten in my mind, every moment with my father now tinged with doubt. My sister's laughter cut through my daze. That familiar sound that used to mean shared jokes and secret plans now felt like shards of glass in my ears. "Don't worry, Emily," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "You can still visit the house, when I'm there, of course." The others pretended not to hear, but I saw the uncomfortable shifts in their posture, the averted eyes. The days that followed passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless questions. I threw myself into my work at the local library, where I'd been working as a children's librarian for the past 5 years. The routine of story time and helping kids find their next favorite book provided some comfort, but every time I read a story about family love, I felt the wound reopen. I spent evenings going through the few boxes of personal items I'd managed to take from the house before Sarah changed the locks. Each photograph seemed to tell a different story now. There was the summer vacation in Cape Cod when I was 12. Dad had taught both of us to sail, but now I remembered how he'd spent extra time with Sarah, teaching her the finer points of navigation. The Christmas morning when we were teenagers, Sarah had received a car while I got a laptop, and I'd convinced myself it was because I was more academically focused. Even our graduation gifts suddenly seemed uneven in hindsight, her trip to Europe versus my weekend in New York. The whispers at family gatherings became impossible to ignore. Aunt Margaret's pointed comments about some people just managing their money better at Sunday dinner. Cousin Michael's awkward attempts to include me in conversations about family investments, only to have Sarah smoothly take over. Every interaction felt tainted by the knowledge that in our father's final judgment, I had somehow fallen short. Some nights, I'd walk along the Charles River, watching the lights of Cambridge reflect off the water. The same path Dad and I used to take when I was struggling with decisions or needed advice. Now those memories felt like borrowed moments, scenes from someone else's life. The river kept flowing, indifferent to my pain, while across its waters, life in Boston continued as if my world hadn't just shattered into a million pieces. One particularly dark evening, I found myself outside our old house. The porch light was on, and through the bay windows, I could see Sarah hosting what appeared to be a dinner party. The sound of laughter drifted out onto the street, and for a moment, I was transported back to similar evenings when our family was whole. But as I stood there, a stranger on the sidewalk, I realized that version of my life was gone forever. The weight of rejection pressed down on me like the heavy snow that blankets Boston in winter, and I knew I needed to find a way forward, even if I couldn't yet see the path. The weeks following the reading blurred together like the gray clouds that hung persistently over Boston's skyline. I tried to maintain my routine, morning coffee from Dunkin' on the corner, my shifts at the library, evening walks along Commonwealth Avenue, but everything felt hollow. Each time I passed our family's law firm building on State Street, my stomach would clench at the sight of Sarah's name freshly painted on the window, Sullivan, Peterson, and Associates. My tiny apartment in Somerville, which had always felt cozy and sufficient, now seemed like a glaring testament to my failure. Sarah made sure everyone knew about her renovations to our childhood home, sending photos to the family group chat of contractors tearing out Dad's old study and replacing it with what she called a modern home office. Each message felt like a deliberate reminder of what I'd lost. The weekly family dinners at Aunt Margaret's became an exercise in endurance. Her triple-decker in Dorchester had always been neutral territory for our extended family, but now it felt like a courtroom where I was perpetually on trial. "Emily, dear," she'd say, passing the potatoes, "have you thought about going back to school? Maybe get an MBA like Sarah did?" The suggestion always came with a pointed look that made it clear she was thinking about Dad's decision. One Sunday evening, as rain pattered against the windows of Aunt Margaret's dining room, Cousin Tommy accidentally let slip that Sarah had been meeting privately with Dad for months before his death. Business meetings, he'd called them, before Aunt Margaret's sharp glance cut him off. The pot roast I'd been eating turned to ash in my mouth as I pieced together all those mysterious lunch appointments Dad had mentioned in passing. I started avoiding family gatherings after that, making excuses about work commitments or fictional social engagements. Instead, I spent my evenings at the public garden, watching families feed the duck boats and tourists take pictures on the bridge. Sometimes I'd sit for hours on the same bench where Dad used to take us for ice cream after school, trying to understand what I'd done wrong, why I hadn't been worthy of his trust. The isolation grew deeper as summer approached. Sarah hosted a 4th of July party at our house, and invited everyone except me. I learned about it through Instagram photos, my cousins drinking wine in our old kitchen, kids playing in the backyard where Sarah and I used to build snow forts, Uncle Pete grilling on the deck Dad and I had stayed together one memorable weekend when I was 16. The exclusion stung worse than a sunburn. My friend Rachel, a fellow librarian who'd known me since our undergrad days at BU, tried her best to help me through it. "Come stay with me in Jamaica Plain for a while," she offered one evening as we sat at our favorite bar in Davis Square. Get away from all the family drama. But I couldn't bring myself to leave my apartment, afraid that somehow driving that extra distance from my old life would make the loss more permanent. The sleepless nights became my constant companion. I'd lie awake, replaying every interaction with Dad from the past few years, searching for signs I might have missed. Had he been disappointed when I chose library science over law school? When I took a job helping children discover the joy of reading instead of following his footsteps into corporate law? Was my dedication to public service somehow less valuable than Sarah's pursuit of profit? One particularly dark morning, I ran into Sarah at our local Starbucks. She was wearing one of Dad's old Harvard Law sweatshirts, altered to fit her perfectly. "Oh, Emily," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "you look tired. Still having trouble sleeping? You know, I could recommend a great therapist, now that I have access to the premium health insurance from the firm." The casual cruelty of her words followed me around for days, echoing in my head during quiet moments at the library's reference desk. The bitterness began to affect my work. During story time, I couldn't bring myself to read books about loving families or sharing between siblings. My supervisor, Ellen, noticed the change. "You used to light up the room," she said gently one afternoon. "Now it's like you're reading these stories from behind a wall." She was right. I had built a wall, brick by brick, with each new slight and rejection from my family. I started taking longer routes home, avoiding the familiar streets that held too many memories. Instead of walking through Back Bay, I'd take the Red Line to Central Square and wander through MIT's campus, where nobody knew me as James Sullivan's disappointing younger daughter. The anonymity was comforting, but it was a hollow sort of comfort, like filling up on bread before a meal. The final straw came when Sarah decided to sell Dad's collection of first edition books he'd promised would be shared between us, books we'd spent countless Saturdays hunting for in dusty shops along Newberry Street. I found out when a dealer from Brattle Bookshop called to verify the collection's provenance. My protest that some of those books were meant for me was met with uncomfortable silence, followed by a polite explanation that the seller had provided clear proof of ownership. That night, alone in my apartment with a glass of wine I couldn't really afford, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about legacy, about belonging, about a lifetime of memories being rewritten without my consent. The taste of rejection was bitter, like coffee left too long on the burner, and it filled every corner of my life. Yet somewhere in the depths of that bitter night, as I watched the lights of passing cars cast shadows on my ceiling, I felt something shift. A small voice inside me, one that sounded surprisingly like my mother's, whispered that there had to be more to this story. Dad might have left everything to Sarah, but Mom had always seen me differently. And maybe, just maybe, that was the key I'd been missing all along. It was a dreary September afternoon when Rachel finally convinced me to tackle the storage unit in Medford where I'd hastily stashed boxes from my old bedroom. The space smelled of dust and forgotten memories, filled with artifacts from a life that no longer felt like mine. As we sorted through cardboard boxes labeled in my teenage handwriting, the rain drummed steadily on the metal roof above us. "Emily, what's this?" Rachel asked, pulling out a weathered hat box from behind a stack of college textbooks. I recognized it immediately. It had belonged to my mother, Catherine. The pale blue fabric was faded now, but the delicate white flowers along the rim were still visible. Mom had kept it on the top shelf of her closet, and I'd always assumed it contained nothing more than old photos or perhaps a vintage hat. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the lid. Inside, beneath layers of tissue paper and old concert programs from Symphony Hall, lay a sealed envelope with my name written in my mother's elegant handwriting. The sight of it made my throat tight. Mom had passed away when I was 19, during my sophomore year at Boston University. Sarah had been away at Harvard Law, too busy with finals to come home until the very end. "I need a minute," I whispered to Rachel, who squeezed my shoulder and murmured something about getting us coffee from the Dunkin' down the street. Once alone, I carefully opened the envelope, trying not to tear the paper that my mother had touched over a decade ago. The letter inside was dated just 2 weeks before she died. My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, you've finally cleaned out that storage unit I've been nagging you about, or perhaps life has led you to search for answers. I hope it's the former, but knowing our family, I suspect it's the latter. There's something you need to know about your inheritance. Your father and I have always had different views on family legacy. While James believes in the traditional passing of the torch, the firm, the house, the Sullivan name, I've always seen something different in you. Something that reminds me of my own mother, Elizabeth March. What few people know, including your father, is that my mother left me a separate inheritance, one that I've carefully grown and protected over the years. She believed, as I do, that true wealth isn't just about property and stocks. It's about having the freedom to become who you're meant to be. Inside the small black ledger at the bottom of this box, you'll find account numbers for a trust I've set up in your name at Cambridge Savings Bank. The pin is your birthday, the day that changed my life forever. There's also a key to a safety deposit box at the main branch. Inside, you'll find everything you need to understand why I've done this. I know your father. By the time you read this, he'll have likely followed tradition and left everything to Sarah. Don't blame him. He's a product of his generation and his own father's influence. But I've watched you grow, seen your gentle strength, your dedication to helping others, your quiet persistence. These qualities aren't valued in the corporate law world your father and sister inhabit, but they're precious beyond measure. The trust contains enough to give you options, to pursue your dreams, to stand on your own feet, to live life on your terms. Use it wisely, my sweet girl. And remember that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in disappointment. All my love, Mom. I sat on the concrete floor, letter clutched to my chest as memories flooded back. Mom in her garden, teaching me the names of flowers while Sarah was at debate practice. The quiet afternoons we spent reading together in the window seat, sharing thoughts about characters and stories while the rest of the family watched football. The way she'd smile knowingly when I talked about wanting to work with children instead of following the expected path to law school. With shaking hands, I dug deeper into the box. The black ledger was exactly where she said it would be, along with a small envelope containing a single key. But there was more. Photographs I'd never seen before of Mom with her mother, my grandmother Elizabeth, standing in front of a Victorian house in Cambridge. Letters between them spanning decades, discussing investments, property, and most importantly, their shared vision of empowering the women in their family to forge their own paths. Rachel returned with coffee to find me surrounded by papers, tears streaming down my face. "Emily, are you okay?" she asked, setting down the cups and kneeling beside me. I looked up at my friend, seeing real concern in her eyes, and felt something shift inside me, like a key turning in a long-rusted lock. "I think I'm better than okay," I said, wiping my eyes. "I think I just found out that Mom left me a different kind of inheritance. One that Sarah doesn't know about." As I explained everything to Rachel, the storage unit's fluorescent lights humming above us, I felt the weight of the past months begin to lift. Each detail in the letters and documents revealed a careful plan, a hidden legacy passed down through generations of strong women who understood that worth couldn't be measured solely in billable hours or corner offices. The rain had stopped by the time we finished going through the box's contents. A weak September sun broke through the clouds as we loaded everything into Rachel's car. Tomorrow, I would visit Cambridge Savings Bank. Tomorrow, I would begin to uncover the full extent of what my mother had left me. But today, sitting in that storage unit surrounded by the proof of my mother's love and foresight, I finally understood that I hadn't been rejected at all. I'd been chosen for a different path. As we drove back through the familiar streets of my childhood, past Harvard Yard where Sarah had spent her law school years, past the public garden where Mom used to take me to feed the ducks, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Dad's death: hope. Not just hope for financial security, but hope that there was a bigger story at play, one that had been unfolding quietly for generations while the louder, more obvious drama of my father's legacy played out on the surface. The bitter taste of rejection that had been my constant companion began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. Mom hadn't just left me money, she'd left me a mystery to unravel, a legacy to understand, and most importantly, a reminder that I was part of a longer story than I'd realized. A story that was about to enter a new chapter. The main branch of Cambridge Savings Bank stood proudly on Massachusetts Avenue, its granite facade a testament to old money and discretion. I arrived early the next morning, clutching my mother's ledger and the safety deposit box key, my heart racing with anticipation. The morning commuters rushed past, heading to tech startups in Kendall Square or research labs at MIT, while I stood frozen on the bank steps, gathering my courage. Inside, I met with Mrs. Henderson, a private banker who'd apparently been expecting me for years. Catherine was very specific about the arrangements, she explained, leading me to a private conference room. The walls were lined with dark wood panels, and through the windows, I could see the morning sun reflecting off the Kendall Square buildings across the river. "Your mother set up what we call a generational trust," Mrs. Henderson explained, spreading documents across the polished table. "She began building it the day you were born, using her inheritance from Elizabeth March as the foundation." The numbers on the papers before me made my hands shake. This wasn't just a safety net, this was freedom. But the safety deposit box held something even more valuable than account statements. Inside, I found decades of correspondence between Mom and Grandmother Elizabeth, detailing their shared vision of financial independence for the women in our family. There were newspaper clippings about Elizabeth's success in real estate during the 1960s, when few women dared to enter the field. Photos of properties she'd bought and sold across Cambridge and Somerville, many of which had multiplied in value as the tech boom transformed the area. Your grandmother was quite the pioneer, Mrs. Henderson remarked, helping me sort through the documents. She bought properties near MIT when everyone thought she was crazy. Now those same buildings house some of the most valuable tech companies in the city. The morning turned to afternoon as we pieced together the full scope of my inheritance. Mom had followed Elizabeth's example, quietly investing in emerging technologies and local real estate. She'd worked with women-owned businesses, providing seed money for startups long before it was trendy. The trust had grown steadily, managed by a team of financial advisors who shared her values. I called Rachel during my lunch break, my voice shaking with excitement. "You won't believe this," I said, watching people hurry past the bank's windows. Mom and Grandmother Elizabeth, they built this whole secret empire. And not just for profit. They were helping other women, creating opportunities, breaking barriers. That evening, I met with Lisa Chin, one of the financial advisors who'd worked with my mother. We sat in a small cafe in Central Square, the kind of place that had probably been a discount store when Mom was my age. Catherine was very clear about her goals, Lisa explained, stirring her tea. She wanted you to have options, but she also wanted you to understand the responsibility that comes with this kind of inheritance. The trust wasn't just money in accounts, it was a carefully constructed portfolio of investments in local businesses, real estate, and education initiatives. Mom had specifically directed that a portion of the returns should continue supporting women-owned businesses and educational programs for underprivileged girls. "Your mother believed in creating ripples," Lisa said, smiling at my overwhelmed expression. She used to say that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the positive change it can create in the world. Over the next few weeks, I immersed myself in learning everything I could about the trust. I spent my evenings after work at the Boston Public Library, studying financial reports and investment strategies. The children's librarian in me appreciated the irony. I was finally going back to school, in my own way, learning the lessons my mother and grandmother had prepared for me. The more I discovered, the more I understood why Mom had kept this separate from Dad's world of corporate law. This wasn't about power or status, it was about quiet influence and meaningful impact. While Sarah had inherited the visible trappings of success, I had received something far more profound, a legacy of empowerment and purpose. I began visiting some of the businesses the trust had invested in. There was a coding school for girls in Roxbury, started by a woman who'd received seed funding from my grandmother in the 1990s. A sustainable architecture firm in Jamaica Plain, led by 3 women who'd benefited from Mom's mentorship. Each visit revealed another thread in the tapestry of influence they'd woven throughout Boston. One rainy afternoon, I found myself in Harvard Square, where Mom used to take me book shopping at the co-op. I ducked into the store, now sleek and modernized, but still carrying the scent of paper and possibilities. In the business section, I came across a book about women pioneers in Boston's business world. There, in a brief mention that had never caught my attention before, was Elizabeth March's name, cited as one of the first women to successfully break into commercial real estate development in the city. The discovery felt like a sign. I bought the book and spent the evening at Darwin's, the same coffee shop where Mom and I used to share chocolate croissants and dreams. As I read about my grandmother's achievements, I realized that I was part of something bigger than myself, a lineage of women who understood that true power often works best in the shadows, creating change without seeking credit. Mrs. Henderson had given me access to a small office in the bank's building where I could review documents and meet with advisors. Sitting there one evening, surrounded by papers detailing investments and impact reports, I found a note Mom had left in the trust documents. "Remember, Emily, that fortune isn't just about money, it's about the courage to use it wisely. Looking out over the Charles River, watching the lights come on in the buildings along Memorial Drive, I felt a deep sense of responsibility settling over me. This inheritance wasn't just a gift, it was a mission. Mom and Grandmother Elizabeth hadn't just left me wealth, they'd left me their vision of how that wealth could make a difference. The bitter memories of the will reading began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. Sarah might have the family home and the law firm, but I had inherited something far more valuable, a legacy of quiet revolution, of changing lives without fanfare, of building bridges instead of walls. Now I just had to figure out how to honor that legacy, and how to face my sister with this new understanding of our family's true history. The decision to confront Sarah came after a particularly restless night. Fall had settled over Boston, painting the public garden in shades of amber and gold. I'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering documents, practicing what I'd say with Rachel, and working with Lisa Chun to fully understand every aspect of Mom's legacy. Finally, on a crisp October morning, I sent Sarah a text, "We need to talk. Cafe Vittoria in the North End, tomorrow at 2. Her response came hours later, "Fine. 1 hour only. I have a partners meeting at 4. The next day, I arrived early at the cafe, choosing a quiet corner table where the smell of espresso and freshly baked cannoli brought back memories of Sunday afternoons with Mom. She used to bring us here after visiting the Old North Church, treating us to Italian pastries while telling stories about our grandmother. Now I understood that those stories had been about more than just family history. Sarah walked in exactly at 2, wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her heels clicked sharply on the tile floor as she approached, her expression a practiced mask of professional indifference. "Make this quick, Emily. Some of us have actual responsibilities." I took a deep breath, remembering Lisa's advice about staying focused and calm. "I know about Mom's trust," I said quietly, watching her face. "About Grandmother Elizabeth's legacy, the investments, all of it." The slight twitch in Sarah's left eye was the only indication that my words had landed. "What are you talking about?" she asked, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. I pulled out Mom's letter and placed it on the table between us. Mom left me her inheritance from Grandmother Elizabeth. She built on it, grew it, used it to help other women in Boston. All these years, while you and Dad were focused on the firm, Mom was creating something different. Something that mattered in a different way. Sarah's hands, usually so steady in the courtroom, trembled slightly as she reached for the letter. The cafe buzzed with afternoon customers, but in our corner, time seemed to stand still as she read. I watched emotions play across her face, confusion, disbelief, and something that looked almost like fear. "This can't be real," she finally said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Dad would have known. Would he?" I asked gently. Dad lived in his world of corporate law and family tradition. Mom and Grandmother Elizabeth lived in a different world, one where success wasn't measured by billable hours or corner offices. I showed her the documentation from Cambridge Savings Bank, the investment portfolios, the impact reports from various women-owned businesses across the city. With each document, I could see her lawyer's mind processing, calculating, understanding the scope of what Mom had built. All this time, Sarah whispered, more to herself than to me, while I was fighting to prove myself at Harvard Law, following in Dad's footsteps. She looked up at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time since we were kids. "You knew about this?" "All along." "No," I said, stirring my now cold coffee. "I just found out. In that storage unit in Medford, the one you said I should have cleared out years ago. Mom left me a letter, leading me to everything else." The afternoon light slanted through the cafe's windows, casting long shadows across our table. A group of tourists passed by outside, their excited chatter about the Freedom Trail a distant backdrop to our intense conversation. Why didn't she tell me? Sarah's question held years of hurt, and for the first time, I saw past her perfectly maintained facade to the sister I used to know. "Why just you?" "I don't think it was about choosing one over the other," I said carefully. "You had Dad's world, the firm, the connections, the path he wanted. Mom saw something different in me, something that needed a different kind of support. She wasn't playing favorites, she was creating balance. Sarah sat back, her coffee untouched. "The coding school in Roxbury," she said suddenly. "The one Mom used to mention at dinner. That was part of this." I nodded. "And the sustainable architecture firm in JP. The Women's Health Clinic in East Boston. Dozens of other projects." Mom and Grandmother Elizabeth believed in helping women build their own paths, not just following the ones laid out for them. "Like you did," Sarah said softly. "With your library work. The children's programs." She paused, looking down at her hands. "I used to think you were wasting your potential," Dad said. "Dad saw success one way," I interrupted gently. "Mom saw it another. Neither was wrong, just different." The tension between us, built up over years of competition and misunderstanding, began to shift. It didn't disappear. Too much had happened for that, but it changed shape, became something we could perhaps work with. "I can't just forget everything that's happened," Sarah said, her lawyer's instincts asserting themselves. "The will, the house, the way things were handled." "I'm not asking you to," I replied. "I'm asking you to understand that there's more to our family story than what Dad left behind. Mom and Grandmother Elizabeth created something amazing, something that's still helping people today. Maybe we can find a way to honor both legacies." A waiter appeared with fresh coffee and a plate of cannoli, the same kind Mom used to order. We sat in silence for a moment, the familiar taste bringing back memories of simpler times. "Tell me about the trust," Sarah finally said. "About what Mom was trying to build. I want to understand." And so, in that corner of Cafe Vittoria, surrounded by the ghosts of our shared past and the possibility of a different future, I began to tell my sister the story of our mother's quiet revolution. The partners' meeting was forgotten as the afternoon stretched into evening, and for the first time in years, we weren't Dad's daughters or rivals or even heirs. We were just two sisters, discovering a new chapter in our family's history. Winter settled over Boston like a soft blanket, transforming the city into a quieter version of itself. 3 months had passed since my conversation with Sarah at Cafe Vittoria, and each day brought small but significant changes to our relationship and my understanding of who I was meant to be. I'd moved out of my Somerville apartment into a modest brownstone in Jamaica Plain, using a small portion of the trust to create a space that felt like my own. The house reminded me of the one in the old photographs of Mom and Grandmother Elizabeth, not as grand as our family home in Back Bay, but filled with character and possibility. My first act was to convert the front room into a free lending library for neighborhood kids, complete with window seats perfect for afternoon reading sessions. Sarah and I were learning to navigate our new reality. She'd surprised me by showing up one Saturday morning with Dad's first edition books, carefully packed in archival boxes. "They belong with someone who really loves them," she'd said, helping me arrange them on the built-in shelves. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a start. Working with Lisa Chin and the team at Cambridge Savings Bank, I began to truly understand the scope of what Mom and Grandmother Elizabeth had built. The trust wasn't just about preserving wealth, it was an intricate network of investments and initiatives designed to create opportunities for women across Boston. I spent my free time visiting the various projects, learning from the women who'd benefited from my mother's quiet support. The coding school in Roxbury had expanded to 3 locations, now offering classes in artificial intelligence and blockchain technology. I sat in on a few sessions, watching teenage girls discover their potential, and found myself thinking about Mom's vision of empowerment through education. With the trust's support, we launched a scholarship program for graduates pursuing careers in tech. Sarah's legal expertise, surprisingly, proved valuable as we worked to strengthen and expand these initiatives. She began offering pro bono legal services to women entrepreneurs connected to the trust, finding a way to blend Dad's legacy of legal excellence with Mom's mission of empowerment. Our monthly meetings over coffee at Thinking Cup near Boston Common became less about the past and more about possibilities. The sustainable architecture firm in Jamaica Plain invited me to join their board, opening my eyes to the challenges and triumphs of women in male-dominated fields. Together, we developed a mentorship program for young architects, naming it the Catherine Sullivan Initiative in honor of Mom. At the launch event, held in a renovated warehouse space overlooking the harbor, I watched Sarah give a passionate speech about breaking barriers and creating new paths to success. My work at the library evolved too. Understanding Mom's emphasis on education and empowerment, I developed new programs focusing on financial literacy for young girls. The weekly workshops, held in my home library, combined storytelling with practical lessons about money, business, and independence. Seeing 10-year-olds get excited about compound interest and entrepreneurship would have made Mom proud. One snowy evening, as I was closing up after a workshop, I found a familiar face waiting on my front steps. Aunt Margaret, bundled against the cold, held a box of old photographs. "I've been thinking," she said, following me inside, "about your mother and Elizabeth. There are stories you should know." Over hot tea and molasses cookies, Mom's recipe, Aunt Margaret shared memories of the women in our family that I'd never heard before. Stories of Elizabeth March negotiating property deals in smoke-filled rooms where women weren't welcome. Tales of Mom's quiet determination to build something meaningful outside the shadow of the Sullivan name. Each story added another layer to my understanding of the legacy I'd inherited. The trust continued to grow under my stewardship, but I measured its success differently than Dad would have. Instead of focusing on quarterly returns, I looked at the number of lives touched, opportunities created, dreams supported. The network of women helping women that Mom and Grandmother Elizabeth had nurtured became stronger, expanding beyond Boston to create ripples of change throughout New England. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, and with it came an unexpected invitation. Sarah asked me to speak at her firm's Women's Leadership Conference. Standing at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza, I shared the story of our family's two legacies, not as competing forces, but as complementary paths to creating change. Success isn't a single road, I told the audience, seeing Sarah smile from her seat in the front row. Sometimes it's found in courtrooms and corner offices, and sometimes it's discovered in library story times and startup incubators. What matters is having the freedom to choose your path and the courage to help others find theirs. My home became a gathering place for women seeking to make their mark on the world. Monthly dinner discussions in my kitchen brought together lawyers, teachers, entrepreneurs, and activists, all part of the expanding circle of influence that Mom and Grandmother Elizabeth had set in motion generations ago. Sarah often joined these gatherings, adding her perspective and gradually letting her guard down among women who valued authenticity over appearance. As I sorted through Mom's papers one quiet Sunday afternoon, I found a quote she'd written in the margins of an old journal. "True empowerment isn't about having power over others. It's about having the power to become who you're meant to be, and helping others do the same." Sitting in my window seat, watching the spring rain wash the streets of Jamaica Plain, I finally understood what she'd meant. The inheritance I'd received wasn't just about money or property. It was about carrying forward a vision of what women could achieve when they supported each other. Dad's legacy lived on in the Sullivan law firm, but Mom's legacy lived on in the countless lives touched by her quiet revolution. Rachel, who'd been with me since the beginning of this journey, put it best during one of our evening walks along the Emerald Necklace. "You know what's amazing? Your mom and grandmother didn't just leave you money, they left you a purpose." She was right. Every day, I woke up knowing that I was part of something bigger than myself. The bitter taste of rejection that had once consumed me had been transformed into the sweet satisfaction of meaningful work. I had found my place in the world, not in someone else's shadow, but in the light of my own chosen path. And sometimes, on clear evenings when the sunset painted the Boston skyline in shades of gold and promise, I could almost hear Mom and Grandmother Elizabeth whispering their approval. Their legacy lived on, not in marble buildings or brass nameplates, but in the growing network of empowered women who were changing the world, one quiet revolution at a time.